Hello, U.S. history kids. So this week we have three lessons. We've been through the first one on the Battle of Ratification of the Constitution. We had discussed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation last week, which was our first attempt at a national government after the Revolution. We had talked about how those weaknesses prompted a meeting, and at that meeting, it took about 4 days for people to realize that we could not fix or revise the articles as originally intended, that we were going to have to start all over from scratch with a new document and a new government. And of course, that new document, that new government was the Constitution, and that meeting becomes known as the Constitutional Convention. Then we talked about the parts of the Constitution, what was in the Constitution, and earlier this week we talked about the battle over ratification of the Constitution, okay? And we talked about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, of course, are pro-ratification. They are pro-Constitution. Guys like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, who actually wrote essays defending the Constitution to get people to vote on it. And we talked about the Anti-Federalists who were against the Constitution, guys like Patrick Henry, and Richard Henry Lee and Sam Adams, who did not like the power that was given to the new central government. They thought it was too powerful, and they also did not like the fact that a Bill of Rights was not in the Constitution. And that's where we're going to pick up with today's lesson expressly on the Bill of Rights. Okay, so the first thing we need to remember is that ratification of the U.S. Constitution depended on the addition of the Bill of Rights. Okay, the Anti-Federalists kind of forced the Federalist hand on this. They say we will not endorse this document unless you include a Bill of Rights. Now, the reason the Anti-Federalists wanted a Bill of Rights is they wanted to protect individual freedom. They wanted a guarantee for protection of individual freedom. Okay. Now, again, it's not like the Federalists were opposed to a Bill of Rights or they were opposed to protecting individual freedom. The Federalists just argued, look, your individual rights, your individual freedoms are protected already in state constitutions, and the national government is going to share power with the states. We're not going to do anything to get rid of the state constitutions. So as long as your rights and your freedoms are protected in those state constitutions, they're good. Okay. But the Anti-Federalists kept saying, no, we are fearing the powerful central government created in the Constitution. We want these rights expressly stated, expressly written down. So the father of the Constitution, James Madison, okay, decided to write the Bill of Rights. Okay, this is his baby. The Constitution is his baby. He's the father of the Constitution. And like I said earlier this week, I think basically what was in Madison's mind was, okay, if you want me to write them down, I will. I don't think they're needed. They're already protected in the state constitutions. But if you want me to write them down one more time, I will, if it makes you happy. Now, in writing the Bill of Rights, Madison goes to two other earlier Virginia statutes. Okay. And the reason he goes to Virginia statutes is because he himself is from Virginia. But like I said earlier this week, if you go to the other states, if you went to North Carolina or Massachusetts or Pennsylvania or New York, you would find similar statutes in those states. All right. And they're all basically going to say the same thing. Madison's using Virginia because he's from Virginia. Now, those two statutes that he went to, remember, one was the Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason. Mason, brilliant legal mind, just a very, very smart person. And in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, it says basic human rights should not be violated by governments. And we talked about this. This is an idea that goes all the way back to Locke. Locke said all people are born with natural rights, and those natural rights cannot be taken away. In fact, we give up some of our rights to the government in order to get protection for all of our rights from the government. Okay. And government does this by creating laws, and it's our duty to follow those laws. Okay. So Mason is restating these ideas of Locke that also influenced guys like Jefferson and Patrick Henry and others during the American Revolution. Okay. So Mason uses that as the basis for the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Okay. These ideas of Locke that everybody has basic human rights that cannot be violated by the government. Madison also goes to the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, written by Thomas Jefferson. It created a separation of church and state by outlawing an established church. So it basically gives everybody freedom of religion because it says the government cannot favor one church over another, and that creates separation of church and state. And we talked about for Jefferson, this is one of the three things that he wanted to be remembered for: writing the Declaration of Independence, founding the college in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia, and then writing the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. Those are the three things that he's going to put on his tombstone, or asked to be put on his tombstone when he passes away. Okay. Now, that's basically where we got earlier this week. All right. So, what we're going to pick up is exactly what is in the Bill of Rights. Okay. Now, it's important to remember, well, before we get to that, okay, it is important to remember that with the Bill of Rights, the Constitution is eventually ratified by all 13 states. Okay. Some did it immediately off the bat, some waited until the Bill of Rights was actually added and actually written down before they ratified it. But once the Bill of Rights is guaranteed and once it gets written down, then all 13 states eventually ratify the Constitution. Remember, it needed 9 out of 13 votes, or 9 out of 13 states to become the law of the land, which it gets in early 1788. Okay. Now, where we're headed today, all this should be reviewed from the first lesson this week. Where we're headed today is what exactly is in the Bill of Rights. Okay. Now, remember, the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Okay. And the idea is that it will protect citizens, especially citizen rights, from the government. There are 27 amendments total to the Constitution. Remember, the amendments come at the end because those are the changes, those are the later additions to the Constitution. The first 10 specifically are the Bill of Rights. Okay. Now, Amendment number 1 deals with your personal liberties, okay? Things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the right to assemble peacefully. Those are going to be your personal liberties, your religious and political freedoms, okay, in Amendment number 1. Amendment number 2 is the controversial one today. It is the right to bear arms. Now, the reason it's controversial is, of course, it is dealing with gun control, okay? But if you read the amendment, depending on who you are and what your belief is, it talks about the formation of militias, and militias are needed to protect liberty, and militias have the right to bear arms. Okay, so there are some opponents that say, or opponents of guns that are quick to point out, well, we're talking about the right to bear arms in terms of militias only. And there are others that point out, well, who makes up militias? Individuals. And how are you going to have, how are you going to have a militia if you don't have individuals with the right to bear arms? Okay, so that's why it's controversial, and that's why both sides kind of come to this amendment to defend their various positions. Okay, but amendment number 2 is the amendment that deals with the right to bear arms. Okay, amendment number 3, freedom from quartering troops. Okay, the government cannot force us to keep troops in our homes. Where does that come from? That comes from the American Revolution. What was Britain forcing us to do? Britain was forcing us to keep its troops in our homes. Okay, so we want this expressly put in our governmental document. The government cannot do this to us. Okay, it cannot force us to quarter troops in our homes. So we have freedom from quartering troops. Amendment number 4 is freedom against unreasonable searches and seizures. The government has to have a warrant. Again, this comes from before the American Revolution. Britain was forcing the tax collectors to search our homes and seize our property without warning and without notice. And again, we want our government to not be able to do that. So we want a protection of that written down. So we have freedom against unreasonable searches and seizures. Amendment number 5, the rights of the accused persons, okay? It protects you from things like double jeopardy, all right? If you've been found innocent of a crime, you cannot be charged for that crime again, all right? It also protects you from self-incrimination. And legal dramas and movies and TV shows, you often hear people pleading the Fifth. Well, this is the Fifth Amendment. It says they cannot incriminate themselves on the stand. All right. They cannot be forced to testify against themselves and incriminate themselves in a court of law. Amendment number 6 is the right to a speedy public trial with an attorney. Okay. Again, this kind of goes back to before the Revolution. In fact, it goes way back in the history of England. In fact, these are some of the rights that English people also enjoy. All right. The right to a speedy public trial with an attorney. We're trying to get away from vindictive rulers who might decide to punish you just because they don't like you. Okay. And throw you in jail for as long as they want to. All right. We're trying to get away from that. So you have the right to a speedy public trial with counsel, with an attorney. Amendment 7 is the right to a trial by jury. Okay, so not only does your trial get to be speedy in public and you get the right to counsel, but you also get the right to have that trial in front of a jury. Okay, so it's a right to a trial by jury. Number 8 prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. So it sets limits for fines and punishments when it comes to court cases. You can still be punished. But for example, you're not going to receive the death penalty if you steal a loaf of bread. Okay, that's an excessive crime, or that's an excessive punishment for the crime. So that protects against things like that. So there's limits to crime, to fines and punishments. Then the last two I mentioned before, the last two I think are Madison getting back at the Anti-Federalists for demanding a Bill of Rights. All right. Amendment number 9 basically says it's the rights of the people. In fact, you have so many rights that we cannot write them in the Constitution, because if we did, the Constitution would become unbearable because it would become so long. Okay, so you have a bunch of rights. In fact, you have so many we can't write them all down. All right, and we can't go to, at the time it was 13 states, but can you imagine now that there's 50 states, we're not going to write every single right that every single Constitution has down. All right, that would be, again, unbearable. All right, so Amendment number 9 says you have so many rights that we can't write them down. One of the rights that's implied by Amendment number 9 is the right to privacy. Okay, it is not expressly stated in the Constitution, but it is implied thanks to Amendment 9. And then Amendment number 10 is the power of the states and the people. Whatever power is not expressly given to the central government, to the federal government, is reserved for the states and the people. Again, calming the fear of the Anti-Federalists, okay, that this new central government that is going to be more powerful under the Constitution than it was under the Articles of Confederation, it is not going to abuse its power. There's going to be 3 branches, there's going to be checks and balances, and if power is not expressly given to it, that power remains in the hands of the people and remains in the hands of the state. Okay, so we're protecting once again the states and the people, and maintaining this federalism where power is going to be shared between the states and the central government, and just making the Anti-Federalist happy. Okay. Now, those are the first 10 amendments. Those are the Bill of Rights. Okay. And once we get these written down, then the states are going to fall in line, and eventually all 13 states will ratify the Constitution. It becomes the law of the land, and it is still in place today. It is a marvelous document, okay, in that the Founding Fathers are trying to be as specific as possible, but also allowing for changes, which is why we have the amendment process. Okay. Now, our final lesson for the week, our next lesson where you guys are moving, is a review of all of the governments that the United States has been under since it was founded as colonies back in 1607. So we're going to look at the government of the colonies when they're under Britain. We're going to look at the government under the Articles of Confederation, and then we're going to look at the government under the Constitution and kind of compare and contrast those things. So that's going to be in the third lesson for this week.